I was on my way to a family reunion, dressed in my best and ready to see faces I had not seen in years, when suddenly my whole body froze with a fear I could not explain. I turned pale, leaned closer to my husband and whispered with trembling lips, "Turn the car around, now." He looked at me with confusion, asking softly, "Why?" And all I could say was, "Just trust me." That one choice, that single moment, saved our lives. Thank you so much for watching and giving me your time. It means more than I can ever put into words. And before I go any further, I would love to know where you are watching from, so please tell me in the comments, because I always enjoy seeing how far my voice can travel and how many hearts are listening. You see, when I sat in that car with my husband's hands steady on the wheel and my own voice breaking as I begged him to trust me, I felt a storm inside me that I could not quiet. It was not just fear. It was something deeper, something that told me the path ahead was not safe. And I could not explain it with reason, but I knew it with every fiber of my being. I looked out the window at the road stretching endlessly forward, the gray clouds heavy above us, and my mind replayed every strange word my son had spoken to me on the phone the night before. The way his tone seemed rehearsed, the way he insisted I arrive at a very specific time as though nothing else would do. And the memory of it all wrapped around my heart like a cold chain until I could barely breathe. I sat there with my husband glancing at me from the corner of his eye, clearly worried, but still keeping quiet. Because he knew after all our years together that when I spoke with that kind of trembling certainty, it was not without reason. And in that silence between us the truth began to settle heavily. That this reunion might not be the warm gathering of love and laughter I had been longing for, but instead something far more sinister, waiting at the end of the road. I should tell you a little about myself, because without knowing the road I have walked, you cannot fully understand why that moment in the car shook me so deeply. I am a woman who has lived long enough to see joy and sorrow braided together like threads in a single cloth. I raised a family with hands that knew the ache of hard work and a heart that beat only for their well-being. I have known the weight of bills piling high on the table and the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the dark when I thought I had no one to lean on. Yet through it all, I kept pushing forward because I believed that the sacrifices I made were for a greater good. I carried those children when they were small. I worked extra hours when they needed shoes or books. I gave up my own comforts so they would never feel the kind of hunger or shame that once pressed down on me in my youth. And every wrinkle on my face is a map of the struggles I endured to keep our family whole. Over the years we made traditions, some small, some grand, and among them the family reunion was one I held especially close to my heart, because no matter how far we had all scattered, no matter how heavy the world grew, that day was meant to be our reminder that blood and memory tied us together stronger than any storm. I would prepare weeks in advance, thinking of dishes that reminded us of home, pressing old dresses and packing little keepsakes that might spark conversations around the table. I wanted laughter. I wanted warmth. I wanted my children to remember that I had built this family with my own hands, and that my love for them was greater than anything else in this world. But things had started to change, and though I pretended not to notice, the signs were there in the way my son spoke less like a child confiding in his mother, and more like a man with something to hide. In the way his calls came at odd hours filled with urgency that did not match his words. In the way he began to speak of money, property, and inheritance as though they were heavier in his heart than loyalty and care. I told myself it was stress, perhaps pride, perhaps life pressing on him in ways I could not see, but in my quiet moments I felt a distance growing. A distance that scared me more than any storm because it told me that the boy I had once held so close might be slipping into a world where I no longer truly belonged. And still I kept hope, because a mother always keeps hope, even when she should not. So when he called and insisted that I must arrive at a certain time, that everything depended on my being there exactly as he wished, I pushed away the chill that crept up my spine and convinced myself it was nothing. Just another detail. Just another son trying to keep things in order. Yet in that car, with the road unraveling in front of us, and my heart beating louder than the tires against the pavement. I felt all those little signs crash into me at once. And I knew that this reunion was not going to be the warm reminder of family I had dreamed of, but something darker, something that would leave me questioning the very foundation I had built my life upon. The night before that drive kept replaying in my mind, as if every word my son spoke was carved into my chest. His voice had carried a sharpness that I had not heard before, a strange weight that made me pause. He told me again and again that I must be at the hall by a certain hour, no earlier, no later, as if the world would fall apart if I did not obey his command. And though I tried to laugh it off at the time, a part of me shivered at the way he pressed those words into me. I remember hanging up the phone and sitting at the edge of my bed staring at the wall, wondering why my son sounded more like a stranger than the child I had raised, wondering what had changed between us that he now spoke to me with urgency, but no tenderness, with precision, but no warmth. That morning as I dressed, I smoothed down the fabric of my blouse and caught my reflection in the mirror, and I saw not just the lines of age, but the quiet exhaustion of a mother who had carried too many burdens alone, and I whispered to myself that this reunion would be a chance to heal what was broken, to see my family gathered and perhaps find again the laughter that once filled our home. I held on to that hope as we stepped into the car. But hope began to tremble the moment the tires touched the road, because with every mile I could feel the echo of his words pounding in my head, louder than the hum of the engine, louder than the breath in my chest. I sat in silence beside my husband, gripping my hands together in my lap, trying not to let him see the way they shook, trying not to let the fear show on my face. But fear has a way of slipping through, no matter how tightly you hold it. And soon I felt his eyes on me, the quiet question lingering in the air, though he did not speak it aloud. I wanted to tell him everything, that my son's tone was wrong, that his insistence was unnatural, that something terrible was waiting at the end of that road. But my voice locked in my throat, because to speak it would make it real. And I wanted so desperately for it not to be real. Yet the unease only grew heavier. The trees along the roadside seemed to close in, the sky pressed lower, and every signpost we passed felt like a warning I was too slow to understand, until finally, my body could no longer contain the storm inside me. I turned to my husband, pale and trembling, and though my lips could barely form the words, I said them with the force of every instinct that screamed for me to listen. Turn the car around, now. It was the moment when fear overcame denial, when love for my son clashed with the truth of what he had become. And it was the moment that would change the way I saw him for the rest of my life. When those words left my mouth, the silence inside the car grew so heavy it felt like a living thing pressing down on us. My husband tightened his grip on the wheel and turned his head just enough to study my face. His eyes full of questions, he did not dare speak, because after all our years together he had learned that when I spoke with that kind of urgency, it was never without cause. I could see the worry in the lines around his mouth. I could feel the hesitation in his hands, yet he did not argue, he did not demand an explanation. He simply trusted me. And in that trust there was both comfort and sorrow. Comfort because I was not alone in that terrifying moment. Sorrow because I could not bring myself to tell him the truth that was forming inside me. That the very son we had raised with hope and sacrifice might be the reason I felt danger ahead. As the car began to slow, the tires humming softer against the pavement, I closed my eyes and tried to steady my breath. But all I could hear was the echo of my son's voice from that last call, the sharpness, the insistence, the strange edge of something hidden beneath his words, and it wrapped around me like ice, making every bone in my body ache with dread. I thought of the nights I stayed awake sewing clothes so he could walk proudly into school, of the meals I skipped so he could have enough on his plate, of the dreams I set aside so his path would be smoother than mine had ever been. And I wondered how all of that love had twisted into this, into a command that carried not care but calculation, not warmth but a chilling finality. The world outside the window seemed to blur as we turned away from the road that should have led us to the reunion hall. The sky heavy with gray clouds that hung lower and lower, as though even heaven was warning me not to take another step forward. My husband finally broke the silence, his voice soft but edged with fear. "Why are we turning back? What is happening?" And though my heart wanted to pour everything out to him, to tell him that my soul was screaming that something terrible awaited us if we continued, the words that left my lips were no more than a whisper. "Just trust me." I felt tears sting my eyes, because I knew he deserved more than that. Yet I also knew that to speak the truth would break me in a way I was not yet ready to face. For the truth was that my own son, the boy I had once cradled against my chest, was no longer the same man who had called me mother. The car curved gently back toward home, the road behind us vanishing into distance, and as it did I felt a strange mixture of relief and grief. Relief that I had listened to the instinct pounding in my chest, grief because I understood that by saving myself I had also admitted something I had been fighting to deny. That my son's heart no longer beat in rhythm with mine, and that realization cut deeper than any wound I had ever known. As we drove away from that road, my body sank into the seat. Yet there was no true comfort in the motion, because every part of me still trembled, as if danger clung to my skin. And I could not shake the image of what might have happened if I had stayed silent and ignored the pounding in my chest. My husband kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his jaw tight, his silence heavy. And though he said nothing, I could feel the storm of questions swirling inside him. But he did not press me. And that quiet loyalty only deepened the ache in my heart. I wanted to reach for his hand, to explain everything I had pieced together in the hollow spaces of my mind. But the words felt like stones I could not lift. Because, how do you tell the man who built a family with you that the son you both raised might have guided you toward your own destruction? The rhythm of the tires seemed slower now. The world outside shifting into calmer roads lined with familiar houses. Yet the relief I should have felt never came, for in its place grew a grief so sharp it stole the air from my lungs. I thought of my son's smile as a boy, how he used to run into my arms after school, how he once held my hand as if letting go would mean losing everything. And I compared it to the man who had called me with such urgency, demanding I follow his instructions without question. A man whose words carried no love, only control. And that contrast was a wound I could not close. I sat there staring out the window, watching the trees blur into shadows, and in that moment, I realized that I was not just turning away from the reunion. I was turning away from the illusion I had been clinging to. The illusion that my son still cared for me as he once did. It felt like mourning, as though someone had died, yet he was still alive, still breathing somewhere out there. And the cruelest part was knowing that the person who had died was not me, but the version of him I had loved so completely. I whispered softly to myself, so low that even my husband could not hear. "Why would you do this to me? Why would you lead me into harm when all I ever did was give you everything I had?" The words tasted bitter on my tongue, and the silence that followed pressed harder than ever, because I knew there would never be an answer that could ease that pain. What I felt in that car was more than fear. It was the beginning of acceptance, that sometimes the greatest danger does not come from strangers on dark roads, but from the very ones who once promised to stand by you. And that truth was a weight I would carry from that day forward. When we finally pulled into our driveway, the engine's hum faded into silence. But inside me, the noise only grew louder, my thoughts colliding with one another, until I could hardly think straight. And as I stepped out of the car, I felt my knees weaken beneath me. Not because of age, but because the weight of what I had just escaped was almost too much to bear. My husband placed a steadying hand on my arm, his eyes searching mine for answers. I still could not bring myself to speak, and I simply shook my head, too afraid that if I let the truth fall from my lips, it would shatter both of us in ways we might never mend. I walked slowly into the house, each step heavy, and as the door closed behind me, the familiar smell of home wrapped around me. Yet even that comfort could not erase the dread still clinging to my heart. It was only a short while later, as I sat in my chair trying to calm the storm within, that the world outside confirmed what my soul had already known. the radio buzzed with breaking news of a tragic incident near the very hall where we had been headed. Voices spoke of chaos, of lives lost, of details still unclear, and my breath caught in my throat, because I knew then without a doubt that my command to turn back had spared us from being swallowed by that darkness. My husband froze, his eyes fixed on me, realization dawning slowly across his face, and though he did not speak the question aloud, I knew he was asking himself how I had known, how I had sensed danger when no sign had been visible. I could not give him that answer, because even I did not understand fully, only that a mother's instinct is a force stronger than reason, stronger than sight, and it had screamed at me to flee. Yet even in that moment of grim relief, another truth pressed harder against my heart, because as the details continued to unfold, I began to see a thread woven into it all that led back to my son. Subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. And the chill that ran through me then was colder than the fear I had felt on the road. My hands trembled as I folded them in my lap, my eyes staring into nothing, because the voice I had heard on the phone the night before echoed now with a new and terrible clarity. His insistence that I arrive at that exact time, his sharp tone, his urgency, all of it no longer felt like worry or preparation. It felt like calculation. And the thought that my own flesh and blood might have tied me to that tragedy was almost more than I could bear. I sat in silence, the kind of silence that is louder than any scream. And I whispered inside myself that nothing would ever be the same again, because when you see the shadow of betrayal in the eyes of your own child, the world does not look the same, the air does not feel the same, and even the home you once found safe becomes a place where questions and sorrow sit beside you, like unwanted guests who will never leave. That night I could not sleep. No matter how tightly I closed my eyes, the images played again and again. The stretch of road that could have been our last, the sound of my son's voice pressing me toward that exact hour, and the news that confirmed disaster had struck in the very place he wanted me to be. I lay awake, with the darkness pressing against the windows, my husband breathing heavily beside me, and I wondered how close we had come to never lying here again. How close I had come to leaving this world, not by the hand of a stranger, but by the choices of my own blood. Every creak of the house made me sit up. Every shadow felt like a reminder that I was no longer safe in the way I once believed. Because danger was not outside my door, it was woven into my family. And that truth hurt more than anything else. As the hours stretched on, I began to think of all the little signs I had brushed aside. The way his calls grew shorter yet sharper. The way his eyes darted away when I asked about his life. The way he spoke of money and property, as if they were the only measures of love left between us. And I realized how blind I had been. How desperately I had clung to the memory of the boy he once was, instead of facing the man he had become. A mother tells herself that her child would never harm her, that beneath every cold word there is still the warmth of love. But in that sleepless night, I could no longer lie to myself. The puzzle pieces fit too perfectly, the timing too exact, and the echo of his tone too hollow of care. By morning my body was exhausted, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years, and though it broke me to admit it, I knew I had uncovered something darker than chance. It was not fate that nearly pulled me into that tragedy. It was design, and the one who designed it was the very son I had carried through sickness and hunger, the son whose life I had built with my bare hands. I sat at the kitchen table staring into a cold cup of tea, my heart heavy with both grief and fury, because the love I had poured out without measure had been met not with gratitude, but with betrayal, and that realization carved a wound so deep I feared it would never heal. I told myself then that I could no longer ignore what was in front of me, that silence might have saved me once on that road, but silence now would only allow the shadow to grow darker. And though my body felt weak, my spirit began to stir, because when you realize the hand that might destroy you belongs to your own child, you either surrender to despair or you stand to protect yourself. And I knew in that moment I would never surrender. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog, every sound muffled, every moment heavy. Yet inside me there was a sharpness that would not let me rest. Because once the seed of truth is planted, it keeps growing until you cannot ignore it anymore. I moved through my home with the weight of memories pressing down on me. Photographs on the walls smiling back at me from years when love still seemed simple. When I believed that family was unshakable. And I could not stop the tears that rose each time I wondered how the boy in those pictures had become the man who nearly led me to ruin. I held those frames in my hands, my fingers brushing over the faces, and I felt both love and grief in equal measure. Because love does not vanish even when trust is broken. It lingers like an ache in the chest, reminding you of what was lost. It was during one of those long afternoons, when I sat staring at the floor trying to gather the pieces of myself, that a voice cut through my sorrow. Gentle but firm, it was my granddaughter who had come to check on me, her eyes bright with concern, her presence a light in the dimness I had been drowning in. She asked questions with care, not prying but noticing, and when I hesitated, she placed her hand on mine, as if to say that she could carry part of the weight if I let her. Slowly, haltingly, I began to share what had been haunting me, the phone call, the insistence, the dread that had filled me on the road, the news of the tragedy, and the shadow of betrayal that I could no longer deny. She listened with a seriousness that told me she understood far more than her years should allow. And when I finally fell into silence, she leaned closer and whispered something that sent another chill through me. She told me she had overheard fragments of a conversation. Words my son had spoken carelessly when he thought no one was listening. Words about money, about timing, about making sure things happened in a certain way. Her voice trembled as she told me, because she too did not want to believe it, yet the truth was already clear to both of us. That moment bound us together in a new way, no longer just grandmother and granddaughter, but allies standing against a storm we never thought would come from within our own blood. As she held my hand tighter, I felt a flicker of strength return to me. A reminder that even in betrayal there are still those who stand with you. Those who see your pain and refuse to let you bear it alone. The sorrow did not vanish, the wound did not close, but for the first time since that drive I felt a steady light shining through the darkness. And I knew then that while my son had broken something sacred, he had not broken me completely. Because love, when it is true, always finds a way to keep you standing. With her words still echoing in my mind, I realized that silence would no longer protect me. Silence had spared me once on that road, but now it would only give power to the betrayal festering in the shadows. So I gathered the little strength I had left and decided to face the truth head on. My granddaughter sat with me, her hand warm in mine, and she told me gently that I could not carry this burden alone any longer. That it was time to confront what I already knew in my heart. And though fear ran through me like cold water, I nodded, because she was right. There comes a moment when running is no longer possible. When you must stand, even if your knees shake beneath you. I asked her to stay by my side, and together we prepared ourselves for the conversation that I had dreaded more than any other in my life. The one where I would look my own son in the eye and ask him if the love I once believed in had truly been replaced by greed and deceit. My husband remained quiet but supportive, his presence steady in the background, and though he did not speak much, I saw in his face that he too had begun to see the truth unraveling, a truth that tore at him as deeply as it tore at me. When the moment came, my son arrived at the house carrying himself with a calmness that felt rehearsed. His smile thin, his words too smooth, as though he thought he could brush away the cracks with charm. I studied him in silence for a long moment, searching for the boy I once held in my arms. But all I found was a man who had learned to mask his intentions behind polite words and lowered eyes. My voice was steady though my heart raced, and I asked him directly about the reunion, about his insistence, about the tragedy that had followed, and for a flicker of a second I saw it. The truth in his eyes before he covered it with a laugh and a dismissive wave of his hand. He tried to tell me that I was imagining things, that I was overthinking, that age had made me suspicious. But I did not waver. I held his gaze and said nothing, letting the silence press down until he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was not a loud confrontation. There were no screams, no wild accusations, only the steady weight of a mother's eyes refusing to look away. and that was enough to strip the mask from his face. In that room, surrounded by the family I had built with my own hands, the truth was no longer something hidden in whispers. It stood naked before us, undeniable. And though it shattered me to accept it, I also felt a strange strength rising within me, because in facing him, I had taken back the power he thought he had stolen. After that day, something inside me shifted. I no longer moved through my home with the same heaviness of fear. Instead, I began to reclaim pieces of myself that had been buried under years of sacrifice and blind trust. I walked through each room and let the memories come, not to hurt me, but to remind me of the strength it had taken to build this life in the first place. I changed the locks on my doors, not just to keep danger out, but to remind myself that I had the right to choose who was welcome in my space. I opened the curtains wide and let the light pour in, because I refused to live in the shadows cast by betrayal. My granddaughter sat with me often, and her laughter brought warmth back into corners of the house that had felt cold for too long. She asked questions about the past, about recipes, about stories of our family's beginnings, and in sharing those moments I felt myself grow steadier, as if I was stitching my own heart back together with each memory spoken aloud. My husband, though quieter, showed his love in the ways I had always known, by keeping the garden trimmed, by fixing the small things around the house without being asked, by sitting beside me in silence when words were too heavy. And though he carried his own sorrow, his steady presence was a constant reminder that not all bonds can be broken. That some love stands firm even in the face of heartbreak. I began to write things down, notes, reflections, even letters I would never send, because I needed to put into words what my heart had carried for too long. And with each page I felt lighter, freer, as if by speaking the truth, even only to myself, I was no longer chained by it. I knew my son had expected me to remain silent, to swallow my doubts and continue as if nothing had happened. But I chose differently. I chose to live with my eyes open. I chose to protect the little piece I had left, and in doing so I found a new kind of strength, quieter, but deeper than before. There was still grief. Yes, there was still the ache of looking at his face and seeing the distance that could never be crossed again. But I no longer let that grief define me. I no longer let it silence me. Instead, I carried it with dignity, like a scar that tells the story of survival. And I reminded myself each day that while I could not control the choices of others, I could control my own. And I chose to keep standing, to keep living, and to keep my heart open for those who truly deserved it. As the days turned into weeks, I thought perhaps the sharp edges of the truth might soften. That time would ease the sting of what I had uncovered. But instead the pieces kept falling into place, each one confirming what my heart had already known, and with every detail that surfaced the wound cut deeper. Whispers from relatives reached me, small fragments of conversations that were never meant for my ears, about money being spoken of too soon, about plans that hinged on my absence, about opportunities that would only come if I were not there to stand in the way. At first I wanted to dismiss them as gossip, but they matched too closely with the tone I had heard in his voice, too neatly with the timing of that tragic incident, and soon there was no denying it. My son's plan had not been careless, it had been deliberate. I remember sitting alone one evening with the last of the daylight spilling across the floor, holding a letter I had found tucked away, not addressed to me, but carelessly left behind in a pile, and the words on that page broke me in ways I cannot fully explain, because they spoke of inheritance, of property, of what would happen when I was gone. Written not in grief or preparation, but in calculation. As if I were not his mother at all, but simply a barrier to be removed. My hands trembled as I set the paper down, my chest tightening until I thought I could not breathe, because that was the moment I understood completely. The reunion was never meant to be a gathering of love. It was meant to be the stage for an ending, my ending. The weight of it nearly crushed me, and I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the walls I had built with my own sacrifices, the home that held every laugh, every tear, every piece of myself. And I whispered aloud, though no one was there to hear. How did we come to this? How did love twist into something so cold? I wanted to scream, I wanted to weep, but instead I sat in silence, Because silence was all I had left. Silence and the aching knowledge that the boy I once cradled had grown into a man I no longer recognized. And yet, even in that pain, a small fire began to burn within me, not of rage but of resolve. Because though betrayal had carved a deep wound, it had also opened my eyes, and I knew I could never look at him the same way again. From that day forward, I carried myself differently, not with bitterness, but with a clarity that could not be shaken. Because when you see the mask fall from the face of your own blood, you learn to trust not their words, but the instincts that rise in your chest, the instincts that saved my life and would guide me for the rest of my days. From that moment on, my world was never the same. Because though I still saw my son's face and heard his voice, the image I once carried of him as my pride and joy had been stripped away, leaving behind someone I could no longer trust. Someone whose love had been replaced by shadows I could not ignore. I moved through each day with the quiet strength of a woman who has faced the unthinkable and survived, reminding myself that my instincts had saved me, that listening to the voice inside my chest had given me the chance to stand here and speak these words to you now. I carried the grief like a stone in my pocket, heavy but no longer crushing me, because I had chosen not to let betrayal define me, but to let survival guide me. And though I could never look at him the same way again, I learned that sometimes the hardest lesson is knowing that blood does not always mean loyalty, and love must be measured not by words, but by actions. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of my story. It means more than I can say. And if my voice has touched you, please subscribe, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and leave me a comment, because I would love to know your thoughts and where you are watching from.